Choice of listening on BBC. Our new book of the week removes the frocks from Dame Edna Everage and allows Barry Humphries to speak in his own voice. He reads My Life as Me, his new autobiography, evoking the Melbourne of his youth and charting the perils of celebrity.
Towards me, whistling, my father strides along the beach. Arms outstretched, he snatches me off my feet and hoists me above his head, a swaddled, chortling cherub, little Sonny Sam. His lips under the marmalade Melvyn Douglas moustache are still chirping a version of that jaunty novelty number of 1934, The Whistler and His Dog by Arthur Pryor. On the beach at Frankston, on that sparkling January morning, 5 years into the Great Depression, I am adored. I wish your father wouldn't try to whistle, my mother often said. If he could only hear himself, he most certainly wouldn't, she would add ruefully. We were staying at Erskine House in Lorne, a rambling white weatherboard guest house right on the sea. The surf was out of bounds for children, and to deter the most intrepid, there were many cautionary tales of toddlers sucked out to sea. Instead, we hopped about at the water's edge, laughing with a pleasurable terror, and ran screaming to higher ground and the safety of rugs and umbrellas as the great fans of foam sped up the beach, demolishing sandcastles, confiscating spades, buckets, and the occasional thermos flask, and triumphantly reclaiming collections of shells and cuttlefish. My parents' habitual name for me was Sonny Sam, and this sobriquet stayed with me until I was at least 6 or 7 years of age. Even the advent of my sister Barbara did not seem noticeably to depress my ebullient spirits. My new sister's countenance seemed always to wear a perpetual scowl. What a disappointing contrast she is to me, I seemed to be telling my parents. But poor Barbara's ill humor was probably due in no small measure to secret torments inflicted by me. My parents listened every evening to the news broadcasts with an almost romantic intensity. Idiosyncratically pronounced by Australian newsreaders such as Monty Blandford and Dick Cranbourne, the European names and places had a sinister yet seductive force. The personage most often mentioned on the radio and in the Sun News pictorial, after Hitler, Churchill, and the ludicrous Reich Marshal Goering, and the one I like best, having seen photographs of him in his self-designed, operetta-like uniforms, was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the egregious Nazi foreign minister. I vaguely knew he was on the wrong side, but I loved the euphony of his name, the dainty undulation of the ribbon, ending with that unexpected and abrupt whiplash of trop. Many years later, sometime in the mid-60s in London, the food editor of the Daily Express asked me to the Savoy Grill for lunch. She was going to write a story about it and invited me to choose my own menu. I love oysters, and I'd read somewhere of an exotic combination called oysters Tsarina. That's oysters smothered with beluga caviar, dipped in cream with a dash of shallots and chopped parsley, and conveyed hastily to the mouth. The waiter had never heard of this delicacy, but after a short delay, the elderly head chef of the Savoy appeared at our table with a magnificent plateful of oysters Tsarina. He looked at me gravely. I wish to tell you, sir, that you are the first gentleman to have ordered this dish since Ambassador Ribbentrop. After my father had built us our own seaside holiday house at Mornington, on the peninsula of the same name near Melbourne, with our own sandy cove, on which the clear waters of Port Phillip Bay lapped with an almost Homeric limpidity, we ceased visiting perilous beaches and guest houses with their porridgy mattresses and dinner gongs, and enjoyed instead the small comforts and pleasures that my father's post-war prosperity as a builder had brought us. At Mornington we had our own tennis court, and a short walk away on Ballura Hill, a long bluff overlooking the sea, there was a new links and a golf club, in which my father immediately enrolled me, with his usual poignant optimism that I might, after all, take up some sporting interest. I had received not only swimming lessons from a Berlin Olympics champion, but also golf lessons from a famous professional and endless coaching on the tennis court. However, I could never participate with the least pleasure or success in any recreation that involved other players. My childhood was filled with reproachful voices saying, "I'll never play tennis, golf, canasta, mahjong, ping-pong with you again, Barry. Ever." Down at Mornington for the long summer holidays, the recreations were mostly swimming, reading, and, for me, painting. I had loved to paint since earliest childhood, probably because my mother often carried my bassinet into the garden, where, through my gauzy veil, I could enjoy the brilliant colours of phlox and pansies, marigolds, zinnias, snapdragons, anemones, and the big Wedgwood blue pom-poms of the hydrangeas. In my first paintings, I tried to recapture this gem-like intensity of my mother's summer garden. I became an avid post-impressionist. I persuaded my parents to buy me the Phaidon books on Cézanne, Van Gogh, and Gauguin for my 12th birthday, and I tried to paint the cliffs and coves in their exuberant manner, using enormous amounts of pigment, much of it applied with a palette knife. My mother would drop me off in her cream baby Austin convertible at a picturesque vantage point, and I would set up my easel and folding chair, anointing my nose against sunburn with the compulsory impasto of zinc cream. By lunchtime, another gaudy picture was finished, and when my mother came back to collect me and my latest masterpiece, there was often a small crowd of curious bathers clustered behind me, gazing with awe and amusement at my rather capricious version of the scene before us. "Look, Kev," I heard one father say to his appallingly sunburnt child, "look at the photo this boy's painting of our beach." It was the first time I'd observed the Australian working-class custom of calling any pictorial image, however wrought, a photo, and was also the first taste I'd had of celebrity. To be sitting there on a cliff top beside the dazzling bay with a small audience behind me, watching every flamboyant brushstroke, was rather thrilling, but it was also slightly disturbing to be talked about as though I wasn't there. Today, because of television, I'm occasionally recognized in the street, and I hear people say to each other at the top of their voices, "Look, there's Barry Humphries," after which they often fall about laughing. They give me a disquieting sense of being somehow outside the human race. Throughout my life, I've continued to paint, a cheerful amateur, perched on Peloponnesian cliff-tops with a wind-buffeted easel, in the shade of Italian cypresses on the battlements of Portuguese castles, or amongst the spinifex on the flat red earth of northwest Australia. The things I paint are a far cry from the pictures I like and occasionally collect, and if a dealer offered me one of my own exuberant works, I would probably never speak to him again. I always travel with my painting equipment, and a few years ago, on a flight from Melbourne to Sydney, I noticed a fleck of bright yellow oil paint on the lapel of my jacket. Remembering that some of my painting kit was stowed in the overhead compartment, I stood up and I rummaged through my gear for a bottle of turpentine and a rag. After a little gentle rubbing, the stain was gone, and I returned immaculate to my seat. Barely a minute later, the chief steward accosted me in a less than cordial manner. He wanted to know what it was everyone could smell at that end of the plane. You see, I'd reached that happy position in life and fortune when, on entering an aircraft, I habitually turned left. "It's only turpentine," I replied brightly. "Isn't it a beautiful smell?" Are you aware, sir, that turpentine is highly hazardous in terms of inflammable? And having it in your possession is a serious violation of the law in terms of the Australian Airline Security Commission. At this period, the locution, in terms of, had infested everyday speech in Australia with the virulence of a plague. I told him politely that I'd not known, that I was stupid, and that I'd never do it again. I thought this would be the end of the matter, but it was not. There were some quick, excited colloquies in the front of the plane, and the Terps was confiscated and put in a locker in the galley. For the rest of the flight, the once smiling, even fawning cabin crew looked at me with expressions of contempt. When we arrived in Sydney, I was met by a senior airline official who solemnly escorted me to a private room wherein he reiterated the gravity of my offence. I wrung my hands. I begged for mercy. Had I ashes, I would have poured them on my head, but the official was intransigent. You haven't heard the end of this, Mr. Humphries. This offence is punishable in terms of a prison term. Airline safety is a big concern, and we want to bring this home to the public. A high-profile individual like you in terms of celebrity is just what we need to get our message across. He sent me home, but with a warning that he would be in contact as soon as the board had met, and they had decided whether or not to make an example of me in terms of prosecution and a jail sentence. Cursing my stupidity, I spent a nervous week awaiting the board's decision, until I finally received a call from a very senior airline official indeed. Is that Brian Humphrey? I didn't argue. Captain Gerald Doig speaking. Australian Airline Security Commission. As you're aware, we're treating your offence with the greatest seriousness, and I hope you know that this is a crime that could land you in the slammer for a considerable period of time in terms of time. I croaked yet another ineffectual apology as the Commissioner resumed. I'm calling you from my own home in Sutherland, so our conversation is off in terms of the record. There is no scintilla in my mind that you could go for the jump on this one, but I doubt that someone in your position would appreciate a vertical suntan. There is another course of action which I would suggest to you, sir, as a way out of the deep shit in which you find yourself. By now, I was listening attentively. My good lady wife, Corin, happens to be a big fan of Dame Enid, which is, I believe, one of your skits. God help her, she actually loves Dame Enid. I would be prepared to overlook this incident if Dame Enid could have a talk to my wife on the phone. It would have to be a talk of no less than 30 minutes duration, Mr. Humphrey. And believe you me, sir, it would have to be funny. Very, very funny. So it was that for something like 40 minutes, with the receiver clamped to my ear and sweat pouring from my brow, I gave the most difficult performance of my life. I could barely hear so much as a titter from Corin Doig on the other end of the line, but my freedom depended on it, and I improvised wildly, and not without that inspiration born of fear and adrenaline. I was just beginning to falter, my mind blank, my throat dry, and Edna's voice a husky baritone, when a stern voice interrupted me. Jerry Doig here, you can knock it off now. She's laughing. Not much, but she's laughing. We will overlook that aircraft incident at the present period of time, but we'll be watching you from now on, Brian. You're a very lucky bastard.
Barry Humphries was reading episode 1 of his autobiography, My Life as Me. The abridger is Catherine Williams, the producer Ned Shire. Part 2 can be heard at the same time tomorrow, and you can hear this morning's episode again tonight after the midnight news. That's at 12:30.
It's 9:45, and on long wave, that's time for the daily service, which is led here on Radio 4 FM, Book of the Week. Barry Humphries continues reading from his autobiography, My Life as Me. Melbourne offers an adolescent Barry a view of a world elsewhere through music.
With only a few exceptions, my mother got on exceedingly well with the women who helped her in the home. These elderly and often indolent satellites all laughed at her jokes, and in later years, when arthritis confined her to a cushioned throne in the sunroom, made her laugh as well. It was with these cleaning ladies, cooks, and hairdressers that she seemed to have her most intimate relationships. Mrs. Ferguson, or Fergie as we called her, was my mother's most trusted housekeeper, and one of the few who really worked, burnishing the arms of chairs and the tops of tables until the varnish disappeared. For years our only housekeeper had been Mrs. Shaw's, or Shaw's as she was known. Her husband worked in the furniture removal business and was given to habits of intemperance. Shaw's talked non-stop, frequently when my mother was out of the room. It was as if her voice was some strident reed instrument that she played in ceaseless obligato to the sonorous accompaniment of washing machine and vacuum cleaner. When my mother found Fergie a real worker, she had not the heart to dismiss Shaw's, so both women formed a garrulous duet, to my mother's deep amusement. It intrigued me to learn that my mother had had a brief, very brief career in amateur theatricals, and her sisters recalled that she'd been particularly funny in a show surprisingly sponsored by the Holy Trinity Church, Thornbury, in which she appeared with a banjo as a blacked-up minstrel. In this unlikely guise, she sang a flapper song from the jazz age of Rouge Knees. I am often asked how I came upon the character of Dame Edna Everage. My poor mother has often been press-ganged into the role of Edna's prototype, and naturally the character has borrowed more than a little from my mother's astringency of phrase. But Edna's garrulity derives from Shaw's, who would follow us from room to room, maintaining a shrill and steady stream of inconsequential verbiage. Aunts, neighbours, and radio programs for housewives also nourished this theatrical invention. My mother's mentor, 3 doors down Christowell Street, was Mrs. Kendall. Mrs. Kendall advised my mother in all the obscure rituals of suburban respectability. I recall once leaving Ada Scott's home with my mother after a rather lavish morning tea. "That was good," I said. My mother smiled. "Bought," was all she said. In spite of their later resistance to my chosen profession, it was my mother and father who introduced me to what used to be called in the old days of Melbourne flesh and blood theatre. Although at my parents' preferred entertainments there was little flesh visible and no blood whatsoever. The theatre they liked was strictly for special occasions. It was a nice night out, a night of furs and perfume, Hilliers chocolates, and souvenir programs. Thus, with my parents, I saw all the big musical comedies, although rarely a straight play. The big theatrical event of my youth was the arrival in town of Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. This glamorous husband and wife team had received massive advance publicity. Intimate photographs of the couple at home, affectionately reading scripts together, eating candle-lit meals, and posing in their rose garden like a sophisticated Darby and Joan, had appeared in Pix, the Australasian Post, and the Australian Woman's Weekly. By the time they'd opened in Melbourne in 3 plays, Richard III, The School for Scandal, and Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth, the shows were sold out. For the Olivier's tour in the 50s, my father had secured the best dress circle seats from the Save Time ticket service, and he bought a ticket for me to The Skin of Our Teeth. My mother felt that the other two offerings might have been slightly unsuitable. As it was, the Thornton Wilder play proved slightly unsuitable for my parents. But as we left, and my mother settled herself into the passenger seat of the family Buick, she broke the silence with her customary post-theatrical pronouncement. "Well, at least we can say that we've seen it." The next morning I overheard her, in a telephone conversation with her sister, summing up the previous night's entertainment as slightly uncalled for. For me, however, the play was a thrilling epiphany. It was so modern, so full of symbolism, which I was sure I understood, or at least almost understood. And Vivian Leigh, wearing the briefest of post-nuclear tatters, donned to be doffed, was the most alluring creature I had ever seen. My parents' bafflement at the play only enhanced my excitement, and it was the first intimation of many that I knew better than they did. At least I could say that I'd not only seen it, but adored it. I was 16 and already beginning to feel slightly foreign. After school, I would sometimes go to a Czech cafe in Sudgeon Place called the Topsy, and underneath the placard at its entrance ran the lilting and gemütlich legend, "It's cozy, it's handy, it's the Topsy." It sounded better recited in a phony Viennese accent. Inside the Topsy, not one word of Australian or even English could be heard. Sitting with a school friend at one of the small round tables, surrounded by clouds of Balkan cigarette smoke, I would devour something amazingly exotic, like a Wiener Schnitzel and sauerkraut, or some breast of goose with cherries, and for dessert, a delicious, if rather diluted, chestnut puree with lots of cream. I would imagine that I was in Central Europe, where I belonged, surrounded by my own people, although, had I but known it, my fellow diners had gone to enormous trouble to put Central Europe as far behind them as possible, only a few years before. John Clement's record shop was another arcane place of pilgrimage on my after-school jaunts to the city. It was not really a shop in the conventional sense, but a small room crammed from floor to ceiling with tiers of crude shelving, groaning with shellac recordings of classical music, in worn brown paper sleeves, crudely ticketed with the scribbled names of composers. The shop was in Aladdin's cave, a place where rarities could be found, and John Clements, the proprietor, a sardonic, unsmiling curmudgeon, seemed to think his task was to discourage customers from buying anything. I would play music late at night on the gramophone when my parents had gone to bed, and winter evenings by the fire were the best. The coziest room in the house was the sunroom, which contained a large walnut-veneered radiogram. It may have been a cold night outside the French windows where, across the narrow driveway, my mother's beloved camellias chafed their dark, glossy leaves, but inside it was exquisitely warm, as I sat in my armchair with a large beaker of the recently invented Nescafe, prepared with hot milk, and played my records. "If you must play music late at night, Barry," my mother would admonish me, "can't you play something Australian? Or must you play all that continental music, Barry? It wasn't that long ago we were at war with those people." When I was 18, I occasionally invited a few friends around to listen to records. A favourite was Ravel's L'Enfant et les Sortilèges, one of the most perfect and beautiful things ever written. Love is its theme, and when I think of my youth and try to isolate a joyous moment, I see again our old sunroom at night, a few friends sitting around or sprawling in the dim lamplight, as we listen to Ravel's magical creation, diffusing its rapturous message. We sometimes attended inter-school musical evenings at the ladies' colleges of Melbourne. They were intimate soirees that encouraged a deeper appreciation of music and of each other. Lively, talented girls, some rather attractive, nestled their cheeks against violins, caressed keyboards, and pouted into flutes. I was strangely moved when one exquisite young horn player paused during the romance of Saint-Saëns to decant a stream of silver spittle. Watching these adolescent recitals with ill-suppressed lesbian rapture were the girls' tweedy music teachers and choir mistresses. We schoolboys had little or nothing to offer in the way of musical competition. My friend Van Senden gave an autumnal account of Syndick's Rustle of Spring, and Freddie Grimwade lowered the tone with a vampy rendition of Heart and Soul. However, on the night we went to Lauriston Ladies' College, I decided to enliven proceedings and to frog-march my lowbrow school and its oafish and tone-deaf representatives into the avant-garde of musical taste. Amongst the many private lessons for which my mother secretly paid were my desultory studies in pianoforte with Mrs. Bremner. Progress had been slow, but enough to convince me that I, who loved music, was no executant of that art. Notwithstanding, I tried to compose. At the very next inter-school recital, when Helen Heatley had sung a devotional song that belied her reputation after school dances, I announced with moist hands and a pounding heart that I would play my own composition, entitled Melbourne by Night, a Nocturne. A hush fell on the twittering audience as I seated myself at the Beale Baby Grand. The work began, appropriately enough, with a very, very long silence, of which John Cage would have been proud. Then my right hand announced an insidious and discordant tunette, which was repeated insistently several times and at different speeds, before the left hand began to thump the bass notes in arbitrary fashion. I played very slowly and deliberately, frowning a lot with concentration, to give the impression that I was performing a written work and not merely improvising. Occasionally I would recapitulate my early, almost melodic motif, just to give an illusion of symmetry and musical progression. The young ladies were enthralled. Their crop-headed preceptors leant forward, listening intently. After a dissonant crescendo with a lot of bass pedal, I stopped. There was a silence. Then wild applause. Pam Horowitz, the most senior music teacher present, stepped forward. "Mr. Humphries," she said, with a sly, triumphant smile, "we enjoyed that so much. May we hear it again?" But I was in improvisatory mode. "Miss Horowitz," I replied, blushing, "I'm afraid I wasn't being strictly truthful." The audience gasped. "You see," I continued, "the piece wasn't written by me at all, but by Edgar Varese, a very modern composer." "That's marvellous," said the canny pedagogue. "I've heard of him, but we'd still like to hear it again," she cooed. "Wouldn't we, girls?" "Yes," they sweetly chorused. "The truth is," I heard myself saying, "I only know the first movement, and the music's at home. Next time I'll play the whole work." Pamela Horowitz, Dip Muse Ed, looked at me fixedly but said nothing. I knew she smelled a rat, but I also knew that I'd called her bluff, the ignorant old battle-axe. Sadly, after that, I could not attend any more of those delightful cultural exchanges, for fear that I might be called upon to perform all 4 fiendishly difficult movements of Varese's Melbourne by Night, a work, strange to say, that is not noted in any edition of Grove's Dictionary.
And that end music was Barry Humphries performing Melbourne by Night, recorded specially for Radio 4 in Boston. He was reading part 2 of his new autobiography, My Life as Me. The producer is Ned Shine.